Hey guys, and welcome back to Seiben's set review for Eldritch Moon. Last video we focused on the strictly green cards coming in Magic's latest set, and now I want to switch my attention to white mana. As with all my review videos, take my opinion with a grain of salt. I'm not the be-all end-all authority, these are just my personal thoughts on the cards, usually in terms of standard and limited viability with comments on their lore implications along with the artwork. With all that out of the way, let's start looking at the white cards coming in Eldritch Moon. Taking advice from a follower on Twitter, I'll be randomizing the cards I review, rather than breaking them up based on rarity. Apparently, some people don't care so much about the commons. I know, right? What monsters! Of course, I'm kidding, but at least by breaking it up, it gives people a chance to see my opinions on all the cards in the set. Let's start the complete white mana set review for Eldritch Moon with Dawn Gryff, a 2/2 flying hippogriff for 2 generic and 1 white. This is a rather simple start, but simple doesn't always mean bad. This card's probably a little too unimpactful to see standard play, but boy howdy is it a nice pick in limited. Evasion is worth its weight in mana in limited, so a 2/2 flyer for 3 is a really nice grab. I wouldn't overpick this card, but it would certainly make me think twice as it passed around the table. It's a decent vanilla card with flying. We've seen different variations of it numerous times. It works well, not much more you can say about it. Blessed Alliance, instant for 1 generic and 1 white. Escalate 2, choose 1 or more. Target player gains 4 life, untap up to 2 target creatures, or target opponent sacrifices an attacking creature. Escalate is prominent in white, so let me explain it real quick. All Escalate cards have multiple choices. You get to choose one, but you can also pay the Escalate cost for each other effect after that. In a sense, making the spell more powerful for more mana. Think of it like Entwine or Kicker, paying more mana to make the card do something else. So what do I think about Blessed Alliance itself? Well, it's an instant spell that provides a variety of different effects, most of which being defensive. Gaining 4 life is whatever, and probably isn't worth the 2 mana cost. But the last 2 can be devastating when an opponent attacks. For 4 mana, you can untap 2 of your guys and force them to sack 1 of their own. That's some great value. Even if you just play it for 2, it can still turn combat around, or result in the removal of a threat. It's a good card. We'll probably see use in Standard, as well as being a great pick in Limited. Faithbearer Paladin, a 3/4 human knight with lifelink for 4 generic and a single white. This is another pretty vanilla common here. Lifelink is nice, but it's not the best standard ability out there. Gaining life, to me anyway, never feels that rewarding. As they say, the only life that matters is 1 to 0. For 5 mana, this thing may be a little pricey for what it does. Obviously not a top choice in standard, but could have a sticky enough body for limited. It certainly wouldn't be my first pick, but I'd consider it as it got passed around. Peace of Mind, enchantment for 1 generic and 1 white. Tap a white and discard a card, you gain 3 life. A reprint here. Peace of Mind is the type of card I'd usually throw to the poo-poo pile because of the little respect I have for life gain effects, but not when printed in this particular block. Delirium and Madness are both mechanics that thrive off discarding cards, and while neither of those are found in white per se, this at least gives white the ability to activate them. This isn't the best discard tool around, but it's one of the best in white. While nothing in standard right now jumps out as wanting to use this card, I can see it being a little useful in limited. If you want to run White Madness or Delirium, this could be one of your best bets. Even so, I don't think this card's very good for either format. Gaining 3 life and discarding in white just doesn't seem like enough. Sigardas Aid, enchantment for 1 white mana. You may cast aura and enchantment spells as though they had flash. Whenever an equipment enters the battlefield under your control, you may attach it to target creature you control. This is an enchantment designed for the heavy equipment decks out there, which I don't see very often but could see more of with a card like this. We've already seen some great ones printed in SOI with a number of interesting enchantments from Eldritch Moon, so I'm thinking white human equipments and auras. For 1 mana, this could be what pushes equipments into standard. Yet where I really see this shining is in modern and EDH decks. A card like this is going to cause insanity for some strong equipment and aura decks in those formats. As for limited, well, this card's a pretty lame duck. It's basically a dud rare. You'll never get enough auras or equipments to make this card viable and limited. Expect to see it passed around over and over again. Desperate Sentry, a 1/2 human soldier for 2 generic and 1 white. Delirium, it gets +3/+0 so long as you have 4 or more card types in your graveyard. When Desperate Sentry dies, put a 3/2 colorless Eldrazi horror creature token onto the battlefield. This right here is the epitome of what it means to be a value common card. Obviously a great card in Delirium decks, it's a 4/2 for 3, solid enough, but when it dies, it sticks around in the form of a 3/2? Now that's value. Of course, when you don't have Delirium active, it kinda shrinks that value, but it's still not dreadful. You still get 4/4 worth of stats for 3 mana. Obviously a possible include in Delirium standard decks, but more tricky and limited. Unless you go Delirium, this thing isn't a high priority pick. It's still amazing for a common, mind you, just maybe not as good as other choices in the pack. Remember, it is a human, even though it summons an Eldrazi, so you still get those human tribal synergies. Also, what's this block's obsession with lambs? I mean, is this possibly Little Gossamer from To the Slaughter? Man, that little guy's been through some rough times. Repel the Abomination, instant for 1 generic and 1 white. Prevent all damage that would be dealt this turn by non-human sources. Prevent all combat damage, the annoying fog cards. Only this is more expensive with an added kick. If you're playing humans, your damage still goes through. It's a trick card for combat that would typically give a human deck a huge advantage in trading, but it's actually hard to tell honestly. Right now in Standard, humans are everywhere, and this card allows all humans to deal damage, not just your own. Sure, it seems great for your human deck, but what about the mirror match? This card becomes almost useless. I don't want to be pessimistic and say humans rule Standard, this card's garbage, but it kind of feels that way. At the very least, it's a sideboard card. As for Limited, Repel the Abomination seems a little niche. If you snag a bunch of humans, sure it's decent, but outside of that, it's just a more expensive, worse version of Fog. Providence, sorcery for 5 generic and double white. Your life total becomes 26. You may reveal this card from your opening hand. If you do, at the beginning of your first upkeep, your life total becomes 26. Firstly, the art is amazing, and the theme of this card is just, so great. With all the cards in this block mentioning and working in the number 13, like that card I can never seem to pronounce, it's cool to see it continued in the opposing color alignment. 26 is 13 plus 13. There are 13 candles on each row in the art, adding to 26. It's a beautiful piece of design. The card itself is weird. If you get it in your opening hand, you start the game with an extra free 6 health points. Later, it'll be super expensive, but depending on what your life total's at, it could gain you a literal ton of health. I can see this doing well in super control decks, using it to counter some of the aggro we see in Standard. It's better than gaining straight life, as it sets you to a certain amount. Luckily for this card, because of the cost, 26 is a pretty high amount. As for Limited, this card is another limp noodle. Really expensive for what it does, in a format that won't allow you to build around it. Ironclad Slayer, 3/2 human warrior for 2 generic and a white. When Ironclad Slayer enters the battlefield, you may return target aura or equipment card from your graveyard to your hand. This is a strictly better Auramancer in my opinion, and another case for the human aura or equipment deck in Standard. It's a solid 3/2 body with the ability to pull lost auras from the graveyard, and you can also grab equipments. Who knows, maybe this makes it into some Delirium equipment deck, allowing you to return equipment you've lost through discarding or self-mill, or maybe I'm putting too much thought into it. Anyway, it's a decent body with a somewhat impactful effect, depending on the deck he's in. In Limited, he's basically a 3/2 for 3, just meh. Courageous Outrider, 3/4 human scout for 3 generic and a white. When Courageous Outrider enters the battlefield, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a human card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. A strong body human with an awesome tutor effect. Courageous Outrider is another strong push for the human tribal deck. A 3/4 for 4 is just under the line for an acceptable vanilla card, but throw card advantage on top of that and it becomes amazing. Though it's not a straight up tutor comparison, in any type of real human deck, you're gonna have your choice of something nice. Even if you get trash, putting anything into your hand is a draw effect attached to a creature, and that's always good value. In Limited play, this card's a little trickier to evaluate. Of course, if you draft a bunch of humans, it gets a lot better, but even without them, it's still a well-statted body at the very least. Geist of the Lonely Vigil, 2/3 Flying Defender Spirit Cleric for 1 generic and 1 white. Delirium, this creature can attack as though it didn't have Defender. Alright, so Geist of the Lonely Vigil is a strong early play card, being a solid blocker and flyer in the beginning and turning into a decent evasive creature later on in the game. As it stands, I don't see this making it into any standard decks. Even Spirit Tribals don't tend to go for Delirium as much. With all the benefits I just stated, I'm more excited to see this card in Limited. Chocking Restraints, Enchantment Aura for 2 generic and 1 white. Enchant Creature, enchanted creature can't attack or block. Pay 3 generic and double white, sacrifice Chocking Restraints, exile enchanted creature. With Chocking Restraint, we get a really nice common removal spell for white. Almost on par with Oblivion Ring, it's worse, but different. Of course, exiling a creature straight up is better, since the creature enchanted by Chocking Restraints can still use activated abilities, but there's a hidden use for this card that people may not be aware of. The option to exile the creature later and sack Chocking Restraints gives you a time-release enchantment spell for your graveyard, setting you up for an easy Delirium activation. I know it may not sound like much, but if you're spending that 5 extra mana to exile a creature who already can't attack or block, it's either gotta have a really good ability or you gotta get something else out of it. I like this card because it's flexible removal. You don't come across that very often. It may or may not find its way into standard control decks, but I know for a fact it'll be an all-star pick in Limited. Selfless Spirit, 2/1 Flying Spirit Cleric for 1 generic and 1 white. Sacrifice Selfless Spirit, creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn. This is an overall solid card, 2 mana for a 2/1 flyer. Sure, the stats are a little weaker than I would like, but then again, this card's basically all about its second ability. This effect is perfect for spirit decks, keeping important cards like Drogskol Captain alive through removal. In Standard, however, spirits are still a little weak. I can see this being used in maybe blue-white spirits. It has nice synergy with Rattle Chains, or it can be an easy way to flip Archangel Avacyn on command. As for Limited, this is an early evasive creature who you can sack whenever for a beneficial effect. Good both offensively and defensively, it's a strong pick. Sigardian Priest, 1/2 human cleric for 1 generic and 1 white. Tap 1 generic and Sigardian Priest, tap target non-human creature. This card has some simply amazing flavor to it. It's a functional reprint of Abyssinian Priest from the original Innistrad block, but it just shows how much the plane has changed during that time. Avacyn is no longer the angel of worship, Sigarda is, and it's just really cool to see that distinction displayed over these two cards. The card itself is a decent drop for human decks that provides a light but repeatable tap effect, maybe not strong enough to mainboard, but certainly a side option against certain standard decks. In Limited, this type of ability is just insane. It disrupts your opponent's attackers and blockers for the cost of only 1 mana. It's a great common and a strong pick. Long Road Home, instant for 1 generic and 1 white. Exile target creature at the beginning of the next end step, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control with a 1/1 counter on it. Although it's a functional reprint of Otherworldly Journey, I look at this card as the successor to Cloud Shift, another card from the original Innistrad block. These spells with flicker effects can really be used for some fancy combos, especially in Standard right now with as many awesome flip abilities we have. Just as Cloud Shift was Thragtusk's best friend, Long Road Home could be a great pairing with Archangel Avacyn. It's also fun to note that this isn't only usable on your creatures, it can act as a bounce effect if you have lethal if you remove a blocker. It's not the intended use, no, but it's something to be aware of nonetheless. For Limited, Long Road Home will be more about flickering your creatures away from removal or combat damage. It's a situational pick. Fiend Binder, 3/2 human soldier for 3 generic and 1 white. Whenever Fiend Binder attacks, tap target creature defending player controls. Oh man, all these throwbacks to the original block, I love it! Although this one isn't a functional reprint, and is actually a lot worse than its previous counterpart. Fiend Binder reminds me a lot of Niblis of the Urn, except way more expensive and lacking evasion. Obviously it's a lot worse, but it holds the same kind of purpose. It's a form of control wrapped into a creature. If anything, your opponent will at least be annoyed by this thing, and may even have to waste removal on it. That being said, I don't see this hitting standard decks, it's just too expensive and weak for what it does. In Limited, however, this kind of card can really make a huge difference. Controlling the board is really important in Limited, and this card does that and it's attached to a body. It's a solid pick. Subjugator Angel, 4/3 Flying Angel for 4 generic and double white. When Subjugator Angel enters the battlefield, tap all creatures your opponents control. One of the few true angels in Eldritch Moon, Subjugator Angel is the type of card limited players dream of. It's a really impressive bomb that can swing the entire game in your favor while also providing a strong 4-attack flyer. It does cost 6, which is expensive, making it less viable for standard, but it's still an acceptable price for limited play. One thing I don't like about this card is that at 3 toughness, this angel can't block very well. Its ability is nice, but you'll only get value out of it if you already have a board presence. But even if you have only a few guys out, it can win you the game, and if it doesn't, you're left with some extra damage and a 4/3 flyer. It's a card designed for limited, and it shows in its effectiveness. Spectral Reserves, sorcery for 3 generic and a single white. Put 2 1/1 white spirit creature tokens with flying onto the battlefield. You gain 2 life. The flavor of this card fits well with those we've seen in the original Innistrad block. It has a similar effect to Lingering Souls and Midnight Haunting. You think, wow, it's the same as those awesome uncommons, and for only 1 extra mana I gain 2 life? That's neato! But you're wrong, it's not neato, it's bad. Those older spells did a lot more while costing 1 less. Lingering Souls had the flashback, which was amazing in white-black decks, and Midnight Haunting was instant speed. Compared to these two, Spectral Reserves just can't hold a candle. I can't see it being played in standard decks, and even in limited, where evasion is highly prized, I don't think 2 1/1 flyers for 4 is a good choice. Collective Effort, sorcery for 1 generic and double white. Escalate, tap an untapped creature you control. Pay this cost for each mode chosen beyond the first. Choose 1 or more. Destroy target creature with power 4 or greater, destroy target enchantment, or put a +1/+1 counter on each creature target player controls. So our first rare Escalate card here, and I'm glad it doesn't disappoint. My issue with Escalate is that the cost to do all the options can get really high. This card bypasses that and goes for just tapping your own creatures, a different kind of cost. The options on this card are versatile and work well with white humans. It can destroy a huge threat, act like Jamoka's command, giving white even more enchantment removal, and even buff all your guys. All this for 3 mana and tapping 2 creatures. The only problem I see is that you need a presence in order to use all the effects, even if you just want to use 2 of the options. Even so, I believe it gives enough flexibility to be standard playable, as well as being a really nice pick in limited play. Ironwrights Cleansing, sorcery for 2 generic and 1 white. Exile target artifact or enchantment. I just love the worst versions of Revoke Existence that we keep getting. But again, this shows just how much enchantment hate white's getting this set. This is the type of card designed for sideboards. It won't ever get a regular spot in standard, and rightfully so. Sorcery speed for 3 mana, there's way better ways to deal with enchantments. This card's gonna see the same fate in limited. It'll be picked late and only as a sideboard option. Drogskol Shieldmate, a 2/3 spirit soldier with flash for 2 generic and a white. When it enters the battlefield, other creatures you control get +0/+1 until end of turn. So this is like the budget white version of Spirit of the Hunt, set to uncommon and nerfed to the ground. This is one of the few spirits I looked at and was like, you know what? I don't think it fits. It's weird, it's a spirit without flying and its +1 to toughness seems a little weak to protect other cards. It does have a solid 2/3 body for 3 mana, that coupled with flash and the buff gives it some value, but I just don't see it making standard. In limited however, Drogskol Shieldmate will be an awesome pick. Flash with a combat trick and a body for 3 mana? Sign me up. Sanctifier Up Souls, a 2/3 human cleric for 3 generic and a single white. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, Sanctifier Up Souls gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Tap 2 generic and a white, exile a creature card from your graveyard, put a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying onto the battlefield. So as far as standard viability goes, this card's on the fence for me. It's a good card for maybe a Delirium deck, something that's gonna give you a lot of stuff in your graveyard, maybe even black-white zombies. Itself getting +1/+1 for each creature you summon this turn is a really nice bonus, but it would take a lot of mana to even make this guy a 4/5 in standard. The flyers are always nice, but again, it's expensive. Everything about this card seems nice, but in practice, I just don't think it will make the cut. In limited though, this thing's gonna be very impactful. You probably won't be using those creatures in the graveyard for anything else, so yeah, get some evasion out of them. It's a strong pick for drafts. Borrowed Grace, instant for 2 generic and a white. Escalate for 1 generic and a white. Choose 1 or both. Creatures you control get +2/+0 until end of turn, or creatures you control get +0/+2 until end of turn. So this is a strictly better Fortify, while being a strictly worse Overrun. But hey, at common, I'll take it. Escalate again proves how flexible it can make cards. You can use Borrowed Grace defensively to save your board or offensively to overrun your opponent. I think it works better in a white weenies deck than anything else, should it be used at all. 5 mana to give your creatures +2/+2 just seems a little too weak. Of course, depending on the situation, you'd basically only need one effect or the other. Probably won't see much standard play outside of maybe aggro weenie decks, and for limited, it's just too dependent on the board state. It's a decent trick, but these aren't the types of cards that win you drafts. Thalia, Heretic Cathar, a 3/2 legendary human soldier with first strike for 2 generic and a single white. Creatures and non-basic lands your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. I already made the comparison between this new Thalia and her old card from the original block, so let's just stay away from that topic here and judge the card for its own merits. What do I think about Thalia, Heretic Cathar? Well, I think it's one of the best low-cost rares in Eldritch Moon, and probably the most impactful card of the set in terms of formats outside of Standard and Limited. The first strike with 3 power means she can regularly beat most other 3-drops. She has the human tribal synergy working in her favor, and important things your opponent plays come into play tapped, possibly messing with their mana curve in the process. This is just overall an amazing card that does things on its own while also helping out the rest of your board. It messes with your opponent's blockers while also giving you tempo. It's an insanely strong card all for 3 mana. Gonna see great use in Standard, Limited, and beyond. Lunarch Mantle, enchantment aura for 1 generic and 1 white. Enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and has tap 1 generic and sacrifice a permanent. This creature gains flying until end of turn. This enchantment isn't bad per se, but it isn't good either. I compare it to cards like Spectral Flight and Pursuit of Flight, both being strictly better versions of Lunarch Mantle. But this is white, which we don't see very often. The buff is strong, but overpriced. The evasion is nice as well, but having to pay a mana and sacking a creature for it? That's asking a little much. I will say that this card is another example of Wizards pushing Delirium in white. It could have easily said sack target creature, which would have fit better with the theme, but by allowing you to target any permanent you control means you can pick and choose those which will activate Delirium. May see play in white Delirium standard decks, and while evasion is important and limited, I'm not so sure this card's good enough to say it's a strong pick. I guess it would be situational if anything. Not bad, but not great either. Faith Unbroken, enchantment aura for 3 generic and 1 white. Enchant creature you control. When Faith Unbroken enters the battlefield, exile target creature an opponent controls until Faith Unbroken leaves the battlefield. Enchanted creature gets +2/+2. Another removal effect for white, similar to Journey to Nowhere, but different in many ways. For 2 extra mana, you get to exile the opponent's creature and you get +2/+2 for one of yours. Sounds fair, right? Well yeah, but it's also a lot easier to remove than Journey to Nowhere. Since it's attached to your creature, all the opponent has to do is remove the enchanted creature. You lose the guy, lose the enchantment, and they get their exiled card back. It's a lot harder to remove Journey to Nowhere. While it may not be the best form of removal, it's still removal, dang it! Thus, it's a great choice for limited play. As for standard, it may just be a little too easy to deal with. Steadfast Cathar, 2/1 human soldier for 1 generic and 1 white. Whenever Steadfast Cathar attacks, it gets +0/+2 until end of turn. Not much to say on this one. While attacking, it's a 2/3 for 2. Decent, but there's so many other better human 2-drops out there. While blocking, this thing is just pathetic, so you may as well just attack every turn to get as much value in the early game as possible. Won't see any constructed play and is a below average choice in limited. It just doesn't have the staying power to make it useful. Maybe if it were 1 mana, it would have been viable, but as it stands, it's just sitting at the bottom of the barrel. Extricator of Sin, a 0/3 human cleric for 2 generic and 1 white. When it enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice another permanent. If you do, put a 3/2 colorless Eldrazi horror token onto the battlefield. Delirium, flip this creature at the beginning of your upkeep if you have 4 or more card types in your graveyard. It becomes Extricator of Flesh, a 3/5 Eldrazi horror that gives Eldrazi you control Vigilance. Tap 2 generic and Extricator of Flesh, sacrifice a non-Eldrazi creature, put a 3/2 colorless Eldrazi creature token onto the battlefield. The first flip card we're looking at here for white in Eldritch Moon, and it's an interesting one. Obviously, its front side is pretty bad. A 0/3 for 3, ew. But you do get the chance to sack a permanent, get a 3/2, and possibly activate your Delirium. I love that this card has the chance to flip itself thanks to its ability. It's self-serving for the card, and it helps Delirium decks overall. With Delirium active, it gets a lot better. You get a 3/5 Vigilance that gives all other Eldrazi Vigilance, with the added ability to make even more Eldrazi. This could be the anchor point for a weird human Eldrazi token deck in Standard. I really wouldn't be surprised if we saw something like that. But regardless, in Limited, it's 2 bodies for 3 mana with the ability to become even better. It's an awesome pick. Dahlias Lancers, a 4/4 human knight with first strike for 3 generic and double white. When it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a legendary card, reveal it, and put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. I love this card. It's Time of Need attached to a 4/4 first strike. I mean, it's just a great combination. Speaking of combos, this card's going to be used in a lot of them. White meld creatures, grab them out. Oath enchantments, sure thing. Or maybe you just want Thalia. It can be used to set up so many fun tricks in Standard as well as other formats. A 4/4 first strike for 4 would have been completely fine. Adding this tutor effect for only 1 extra mana is just insane. Humans really got a strong card here, guys, and before you say, well, legendaries are hard to come by in drafts, yeah, you're right, but it's still a strong first strike for 5 mana. I draft that as is regardless. Get yourself any legendary, even a land, and this card is just pure value. Awesome card. Give No Ground. Instant for 3 generic and 1 white. Target creature gets +2/+6 until end of turn, and can block any number of creatures this turn. This card's a combat trick similar to Righteousness. It's meant to be played defensively to devastate your opponent's creature while allowing yours to live. The stats on Give No Ground are a little stunted for 4 mana, but you trade that for the ability to block multiple creatures this turn. Depending on what those creatures are and what you buff, it could mean a board wipe for your opponent. Still, I think this card harps too much on a specific scenario to take place for me to say it'll be good in Standard. Sure, it turns one guy into a juggernaut, but it varies on how effective it can be. In Limited, it's an odd choice. It can sort of be seen as like pseudo-removal, but even then, it's a hard sell at 4 mana. Only pick it if you're really struggling to get removal. Guardian of Pilgrims, 2/2 Spirit Cleric for 1 generic and 1 white. When it enters the battlefield, target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Another grounded spirit here, and again, it's not that great. This is the lost soul of Kinsbale Skirmisher, and it does just as little. I just can't see how a 2/2 for 2 that gives something +1/+1 will ever be that impactful. Sure, it's a better bear, but it's not that much better. In Spirits, I can see a use for it with Rattle Chains, but even with Flash, the +1/+1 isn't super important. It just does too little for Standard, but it's a decent choice for Limited. It's a white bear that may or may not have a slightly beneficial effect. It's a meh, whatever pick. Lone Rider, a 1/1 human knight with first strike and lifelink for 1 generic and 1 white. At the beginning of your end step, if you gain 3 or more life this turn, transform Lone Rider into It That Rides as 1, a 4/4 Eldrazi horror with first strike, trample, and lifelink. This card's an odd horse. Sorry, but really, a 1/1 with lifelink and first strike's only good against things with 1 toughness, really limiting this card's strength and ability to flip. You need to combine this card with other life gain tools or perhaps buff spells to make this thing a little more potent. The problem is, when you start adding things to make a card good, it usually means it's not viable. That being said, I can easily see this in a modern life gain deck. It's basically a 4/4 with trample, first strike, and lifelink for 2 mana, which is just insane. In Limited, it just won't have the tools needed to be good. It'll be a 1/1 first strike lifelink, which is kinda rubbish. Draven Standardbearer, a 1/1 human soldier for 1 white mana. Tap 1 generic, 1 white, and Draven Standardbearer. Discard a card, put a 1/1 white human soldier creature token onto the battlefield. This is another card meant to activate Delirium in white humans, or even potentially Madness in a white-red deck. As for standard viability, it's a decent early drop that can generate guys. That also happens to throw stuff into the graveyard. If white Delirium kicks off, it can fill some early slots. Where this thing really shines is in Limited. It's not a top pick or anything, but it does really help with Madness and Delirium, all while making some tokens. As I said, it's not a top pick, but a decent look at if it's being passed around. Deploy the Gatewatch, sorcery for 4 generic and double white. Look at the top 7 cards of your library, put up to 2 Planeswalker cards from among them onto the battlefield, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Okay, so a really niche mythic here, but one that holds a lot of value. A card designed with a lot of Planeswalkers in mind, it allows you to search a hefty amount of cards in order to find at least 2. The only issue is, in Standard, Planeswalkers don't really have a Super Friends deck. Out of the 7 cards you draw, you may not even hit 2 Planeswalkers in Standard, which is a huge bummer for this 6 mana card. Of course, as you step away from Standard and get into other formats, Super Friends become more viable, and thus Deploy the Gatewatch gets infinitely better. It's a must-have for those decks. Getting 2 Planeswalkers out from your library to the battlefield for 6 mana is one of the biggest tempo swings at this cost. It's a shame it won't work as well in Standard. As for Limited, well, you can imagine this is probably one of the worst cards to draft. It's one of those mythics that you'll see passed all the way to the end for sure. Virtually unusable. And to round everything off, let's look at the meld cards. Gisela the Broken Blade and Bruna the Fading Light. Gisela is a 4/3 Angel Horror with Flying, First Strike, and Lifelink for 2 generic and double white. Bruna is a 5/7 Angel Horror with Flying and Vigilance for 5 generic and double white. When you cast her, you may return target angel or human creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Gisela is an outstanding card for Limited and Standard. It's strong, it has evasion, and is just overall a stellar card, albeit a little weak on the toughness side. Her sister, on the other hand, is really expensive but still strong. Her ability to get back a lost human or angel could be amazing in some human Standard decks. Think about getting back your Archangel Avacyn with this thing. In Limited though, it's really too expensive and niche to be a top pick, although I'd still consider it a pretty big bomb nonetheless. At the beginning of your end step, if you both own and control Gisela and Bruna, meld them into the horrific Brisela Voice of Nightmares, a 9/10 legendary Eldrazi angel with Flying, First Strike, Vigilance, and Lifelink. Your opponents can cast spells with converted mana cost 3 or less. I've already talked about meld at length, so you can hear my thoughts on this mechanic in that video. The meld cards, including Brisela, need a lot of work in order to pull off in Standard. You'll need help from cards like Dahlias Lancers to tutor out both pieces to ensure they meld before one of them dies. It's going to be a long and taxing experimentation process with these cards, but the end result is of course a powerful creature. Needless to say, I'd be shocked if Brisela is ever even seen in Limited. It's just not something you plan on. And there you go guys, my thoughts on all the new white cards coming to us in Eldritch Moon. Let me know what you think about these cards in the comments below. If you enjoyed my review, consider hitting the like button and subbing to stay up to date on all the latest MTG news and lore. As always guys, thanks so much for watching and I'll see you next time.